And to kick us off with our very first Hamburg session, the session on No Future Europe, I would like to please welcome Niels Annen, State Secretary of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Merje Kuus, Professor of Political Geography at University of British Columbia, to join us at the front. Niels will be doing the first keynote. Merje, please take your seat on stage, along with the panelists. Our moderator for this morning, Tom Nuttall of The Economist, Ole Jakob Zending of NUPI, Janne Jokinen of the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Antje Wiener of the University of Hamburg. Please come and take your seats on the stage. And with that, please join me in welcoming Niels Annen for the first keynote of the Hamburg sessions. Yes, or we can take it down.
Okay. Good morning, liebe Frau Schröder, ladies and gentlemen. I'll wait a second for the panel to organize. First of all, I have to say I'm very happy to welcome all of you to my hometown, Hamburg. I think we have established a very good and close relationship with the IFSH, which happens to be located also in my district, as I'm representing a Hamburg district in the German Bundestag. So you can imagine that when the invitation reached me, I was very happy to answer that invitation. And it's true, we are currently seeing a tectonic shift in the world's geopolitical and economic makeup that is threatening the very foundation on which the EU's foreign and security policy has been built. Instability at Europe's border is brutal, omnipresent reality challenging those effects that has been bringing people within the EU together. And European foreign and security policy must therefore change gear and massively pace up to safeguard citizen security, safety, and instability. And I do think that we have come here to talk about the future of Europe, the European Union, and the perspective for a truly joint foreign and security policy to address that very challenges. What will and what should it look like? What are the biggest challenges? And I have to say that although we have to discuss very serious problems, I'm also coming here as an optimist. I think that this has been a very important part of also organizing that conference, and it's something that we are lacking. So I'm very grateful for that spirit of the Hamburg sessions. There is certainly considerable scope for improvement and reform. There are shortcomings, and the way forward, I think we all know this will be long and difficult. It will be a long and winding road with setbacks along the way. But Europe, meaning for us mostly the European Union, still has a vast potential that is untapped. So Germany is today among the champions of a strong EU foreign and security policy. But we need to invest even more energy in mastering the political will among our European friends and in promoting the necessary reforms in the European foreign and security policy to ensure that we actually unlock its potential. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the only way forward for Europe to continue its powerful success story, especially in the field of foreign and security policy. And there are conflicts and crises on our doorstep, in our neighborhood. I'm not talking about Schleswig-Holstein or Denmark. I'm talking about the European neighborhood, and not everybody is aware of that Libya, Syria, Ukraine, that is our neighborhood. These are things that are not happening at the 8 o'clock TV news. This is affecting us directly. So we are deeply concerned about Iran's accelerating of its disengagement from commitments under the JCPOA. At the same time, we face great strategic challenges. For a few years now, many scholars have been publishing books about an upcoming Asian century while writing off the US and the West as a whole. Do you also note that sometimes even the term West is not being used anymore? I think it's striking to me at least. The US and China are increasingly embroiled in a geopolitical rivalry No doubt, the balance is shifting. A more assertive Russia is testing Europe. The only way to tackle these challenges is a strong and united Europe and a unified European foreign and security policy. So, ladies and gentlemen, where are we now? It's no secret that there are deficits and challenges. Firstly, there has been a lack of a European voice, a joint European voice, and capability to act in a range of crucial conflicts in the European neighborhood. I already mentioned some of them. Syria, Yemen, and Libya are just a few examples of the difficulties in achieving consensus among 28 member states. They show that a fundamental prerequisite for the EU's ability to act is a substantive common position among the member states and their political willingness to give the High Representative a clear mandate to act on behalf of the European Union. If there is no coherent EU position, and if EU member states are not prepared to accept the lead by the High Representative, which must obviously comprise a degree of leeway in the way that the mandate has been implemented, the EU as a whole cannot take a stance nor act as an effective peace broker. Moreover, in some cases, member states must also be ready to take decisive complementary action, such as the introduction of sanctions. In practice, this means that we should work on creating a culture of greater coherence, cohesion, responsibility, and trust among EU member states on key foreign policy issues. We should not, though, expect immediately to be able to cater here for the full range of foreign policy issues in the same way. For a start, it would already be a major step forward if we identified half a dozen of crucial dossiers that are of outstanding importance to the EU's peace, security, and prosperity, on which the EU, under the leadership of the High Representative, could really take the lead on behalf of all EU members, provide significant added value, and make a real difference. A key test for the EU's ability to act as a united and effective policy actor is its success in promoting its interests and values vis-à-vis the United States and China. And another example is, of course, the normalization dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo, on which stronger EU leadership is needed. And finally, the EU must put major emphasis on its immediate southern and eastern neighborhood. And secondly, can unfortunately not ignore that we face Brexit, ladies and gentlemen. A painful decision for the EU from the outset and a seemingly endless and agonizing process that is already taking its toll on the EU foreign and security policy. For many countries and people outside and inside Europe, this has created the impression that the EU is busy only with itself. At the same time, we do have a vital interest to continue our extremely close cooperation on foreign and security policy issues with the United Kingdom, also after Brexit, in order to preserve a strong and broad European position on key foreign policy issues in the world. And for this purpose, we should strive post-Brexit for an unprecedented close relationship with the UK in the EU framework. And if things go well, the E3, for example, Germany, France, and the UK, could potentially serve as a bridge to maintain both a strong and constructive partnership with the UK and an effective and powerful EU foreign policy. But such a development is still far off and will require a smooth Brexit and also prudent negotiations on the EU's future relationship with the United Kingdom. And I think it goes without saying that E3 consensus cannot replace the strong message sent by a statement of the then EU 27. Therefore, it is worth going the extra mile needed for an agreement among 28 or 27, as well as negotiating among EU 3 members and statements. And we have been doing that in the recent past. Thirdly, we also face a regrettable rise in populism that has been mentioned before in many European countries, also in this country, Germany. A populism that is keen to blame Europe for all its ills, even though it seems we might have reached a peak and the tide may turn against nationalist movements, we will see. But if we manage to show the added value of the EU's foreign and security policy in practice, we do have another argument to counter narrow-minded and short-sighted calculations of allegedly national interest. And finally, the EU's recent refusal to officially launch membership talks with North Macedonia and Albania has been met with great disappointment. We have failed to reach a consensus with the EU and have not managed to fulfill our promise to our Balkan partners, who began the long journey to EU membership at the summit in Thessaloniki as long ago as 2003. And I think Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker is right. He has called the refusal to open accession negotiation, and I quote him, a major historic mistake. Indeed, this decision not only harms the EU's credibility to live up to its promises, but it is a setback for our strategic interest in a stable and secure region, in a region that is at the heart of Europe. However, ladies and gentlemen, there is progress to be proud of. It testifies to our determination to stand firm on values that bring us together and to strengthen the Union as a truly global actor. A commitment laid down in the global strategy for the EU's foreign and security policy in 2016. I'm sure you're all familiar with that important document. We have made especially good progress on security and foreign security and defense issues in recent years as we move closer to a future European Defense Union. We have launched the Permanent Structures Cooperation in the EU, in short PESCO, to interact more closely and effectively to pool our resources. We now have an EU military command center, or I have to be precise, the military planning and conduct capability, which significantly strengthens Europeans' crisis management capacity through central command and control over EU's military training missions. And moreover, the European Defence Fund has been launched to foster innovation and develop defence technology that will help to promote defence cooperation among companies and between EU countries. And during our upcoming EU presidency, we will open the European Centre of Excellence for Civilian Crisis Management as a service provider for the European Union, notably for EU member states, in support of an enhanced and more effective civilian and security defense policy. So, ladies and gentlemen, we stand firm on our European values. Right now, discussions about the new horizontal sanctions regime are underway that would allow the EU to list persons and entities involved in gross human rights violations and to send a strong signal, a worldwide signal, that such terrible crimes will have consequences. Germany is committed to concluding negotiations on the regime, adding a new tool to our foreign policy toolbox. I do think it is important to have a realistic view of the challenges, while at the same time confidently presenting these achievements instead of overemphasizing the shortfalls. At the end of the day, we also have a job to do to convince our own citizens that we are on the right track. What else can we do to further bolster progress in Europe? One of the elements hampering rapid and bold decision-making in the EU is that we only have a very few cases in foreign and security policy in which the Lisbon Treaty foresees the possibility of a qualified majority voting, in short, QMV. And in those cases where EU member states could take decisions by QMV, they are shying away from actually doing so. Therefore, again and again, individual member states exert their de facto veto in order to water down statements or block decisions outright. I could tell you about a lot of examples for that, just happening in the last days. I don't want to get into too much detail because it's rather frustrating, but it's really a problem for our foreign security policy. Therefore, Germany has been systematically advocating the use of that instrument, also the extension of QMV to other suitable parts of CFSP, as explicitly foreseen by treaty. After all, it was clear that the drafting stage, that consensus building among 28 EU member states will require additional incentives and dynamics to actually go the extra mile and reach viable consensus. If we do not manage to find such ways of injecting additional flexibility into our negotiations, unanimity will too often remain the winning card up the sleeve for some member states to prevent the actual use and also extension of QMV. Another aspect, also very interesting, the use of constructive abstention is another possibility to enable an overwhelming majority of EU member states to take decisions. So far, however, there is only one case in which a member state has made use of that possibility. Similarly, in spite of the remarkable campaign by the Commission to increase QMV, the vast majority of EU member states remains very hesitant, to put it mildly, concerned about potential negative impacts on their vital national interest. Yet, for such cases where crucial interests are at stake, the treaty in fact foresees an exception. We will therefore continue pushing for the use of QMV in the framework of the Lisbon Treaty. But while QMV is one important element in increasing the EU's ability to take faster and more effective decisions, it won't solve all of our problems, as it only limited to formal legal acts and does not apply to EU statements or Council conclusions. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to be aware of the fact that our common foreign and security policy sometimes touches upon extremely sensitive issues from a national perspective. In practice, we should therefore increase our efforts to create a culture of trust among EU member states on key foreign policy issues, that we can increase our leverage without making use of new procedures. We must speak with one voice, even if we do not always agree 100% all the time. Moreover, the consensus among member states, the High Representative and the EU institutions on necessary common action to promote peace and security, resilience and prosperity, human rights and rules-based multilateral order must evolve continuously. For instance, we need to embark on a further work on a common strategy culture among EU member states to ensure an up-to-date and sufficiently concrete assessment of major threats and challenges, and the joint commitment among EU member states to common responses. Therefore, also an urgent need for a more joined-up approach to ensure a credible and effective EU foreign and security policy. Ursula von der Leyen's new geopolitical commission, if I may call it so, must deliver here more than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be only able to meet today's challenges if we know our medium to long-term goals. A European Union which is itself democratic, acting in solidarity and showing resilience. A European Union which enjoys ever closer and amicable relationship with its neighbors. A European Union which serves as a central cornerstone of a peaceful rules and value-based international order. And a European Union which actively promotes human rights, social justice, good governance, as well as multilateral institutions worldwide. Having sketched out these challenges and aims, there can be no doubt the European Union is at the core of Germany's foreign and security policy. This that is not something, and I also came here to reassure you, that is not something that is going to change. Thank you very much for your attention and the invitation.
Good morning. I begin with the famous observation, often cited but seldom followed, that between stimulus and response, a person has the freedom to choose. I begin with that point, both cliched and profound, because it can help us to see open-ended choice, where we tend to see pre-given necessity. It reminds us to think through what pathways of thought and imagination we choose. In keeping with the organizers' effort to turn the lens on some taken-for-granted pessimism, I point to two ways in which that pessimism is chosen and can therefore be changed. The first of these points concerns the mistaken unease about multiplicity and ambiguity in European Union decision-making and the resulting equally mistaken effort to tidy things up into a neat set of interests or agendas. The second of my 2 points concerns state envy, the tendency to think about various problems in terms of territorial or state-like power. My effort is not to say things we do not yet know. My effort is rather to foreground points that we kinda do know, but tend to put aside as overly complicated to be fully considered. Both of my points are about some common blind spots about the actual geographies of power and influence in today's world. Too often, the discussion about Europe's future is narrowed by the ways in which that discussion is set up in the first place. The result is predetermined. To get a different result or a different policy, we need to change the setup, the perspective we use to first imagine and then devise the policy. To say that Europe's future depends on perspective and not on policy is to say that different policies cannot be crafted until certain habitual disabling lenses on the reality of Europe are transformed into something more enabling. All seeing comes from a perspective. And what I see about Europe is derived in part from where I see Europe. I grew up in Estonia, not exactly a central place in Europe. I now live and work in Vancouver, far from Europe. As an academic, I have spent the last 12 years doing peopled or anthropological studies of the geographies of influence and authority in European Union diplomacy. I have done this, however, not from the customary angle of political science, but from the angle of political geography. You will see that the question of where of our mental maps is central to my argument here. My first point then is about multiplicity and ambiguity. Many people wish that the EU would develop a more unified policy line, especially in the big strategic issues of geopolitics and external relations. Analysts try to distill or detect the one position, the one that seems to be emerging or ought to be emerging, that can tie together the different agendas into one core issue. Multiplicity, ambiguity, and messiness are cast as unfortunate roadblocks, and energies are directed to clearing things up into something more consistent. This is logical on the one hand. However, it condemns the commentators to eternal disappointment. In the European Union, every crack in a roadblock only ever opens onto another roadblock. The interminable grind of barely palatable compromises of which EU decisions are made is recognized in theory. It is usually recognized by those who practice the grind in Brussels. But I am puzzled by how many people in policy, popular, and academic circles insist on hearing a neat line of what the EU is doing or what it ought to do. I am puzzled by how often EU experts, both officials and academics, apologize for EU-level processes being messy. They see complexity as a problem. I regularly observe at various events on EU external action that the so-called EU perspective offered by a scholar or European Union diplomat is a remarkably cautious, even timid perspective. It is deeply deferential to whatever anyone cares to define as a national interest. If the exchange at such an event begins to resemble a debate, those who project the state-based perspective win handily. At some point, this deference to the nation-state ceases to be level-headed and becomes unimaginative. It reproduces the idea that the European Union is not and cannot be a powerful actor on the world stage. This unease about complexity and ambiguity stems from a blind spot about the highly textured geographies of power in Europe. It is not simply that the EU is complicated. It is also that the Union is, to this day, Europe's unidentified political object. We try to make sense of that object using our familiar language of the nation and the state as if we were discussing something vaguely state-like. This is a familiar way of doing things. And it leads us to overlook the geographically rooted assumptions we ourselves bring into the discussion. A European perspective always comes from somewhere more specific, both geographically and sociologically, than a national capital. That somewhere, the where of that historical metaphor or geographical analogy matters. In the practice of EU decision-making, the where of the speaking mannerisms, the accents, the idioms that don't quite work in English, French, or German matter. The clothing styles that betray the national capital where the clothes were purchased matter. In EU institutions, all jobs and all deliberations are geopolitical in that they are closely bound up with geographical imaginaries of where Europe and Europeanness are assumed to be. Dialogues about Europe too often trade in parochialism dressed up as cosmopolitanism. The task, then, is to examine not only what we think about EU external action, but also where we think from, the usually unspoken geographical roots of our ideas and practices. We need to examine the know-where and not only the know-how of EU-level policy claims. Actual places, as experienced and imagined, anchor conceptions of what Europe is, how it works, or how it ought to work. The task is not to create a smooth, technocratic space in which that geography no longer matters. The task is to acknowledge and examine that geography. The effort, in other words, should not be to reach for some lofty, disembodied space of European cosmopolitanism. It should rather be to work with the actual geographical rootedness of perspective without either molding it into a patchwork of states or scaling it up into Europe as a state-like structure. That texture of power is detected in Brussels, but it cannot be neatly defined. In my interviews with diplomats, I observed that several interviewees in different EU and national institutions instinctively reach for tactile gestures to characterize the production of European Union level consensuses. Gestures of feeling a fabric between their fingers to test its quality, feeling a handful of sand pass through their fingers, or feeling the contours of something amorphous and hard to grasp. They use these gestures in part to indicate a certain difference between national and EU level decision making. As my work progressed, notes about such cloth gestures increasingly appeared in my notes as I learned to notice these gestures. In a national capital, a national diplomat in Brussels explains, one learns the national line. In Brussels, it is a bit more, and he does the cloth gesture. And he says, you cannot apply what you learned in your ministry. You notice here that EU decision-making is not seen as bigger or smaller, weightier or lighter than the national kind. It is seen as different, as more textured. The difference is felt, but not clearly articulated verbally. It remains undefined. My first point was thus about the geographical as well as sociological rootedness and texture of all perspective in Europe. My second related point is about nation envy, or the geographical bounding of power and influence. Much of what is said about politics and identity in today's Europe tells a familiar story of national competition and national identity. It channels our thinking into a territorial, state-like frame of power. What this does is it downplays questions about the actual nowhere, the geography of European Union's regulatory power. Europe's power, in other words, is obscure in part because our analytical tools make it such. The problem is not that the EU has not yet acquired sufficient amounts of what might be called real power. The problem is rather that our conceptions of power, our pre-existing lenses, are ill-suited for capturing transnational regulatory power. For example, much has been said about identity and migration, of passports in the discussions of Brexit. Little has been said outside specialized media of passporting rights, the capacity of companies to operate across the single market. A passport is a visible, tangible artifact of the interstate system. Passporting is an invisible, intangible capacity of a transnational regulatory space. Passport is a thing, passporting is a process. When people say that the EU is not a strong power, or it is becoming perhaps a stronger one, or that it is finally growing up, they tacitly frame power in state-like terms. That assumption holds in Brussels as much as in national capitals. Yet EU decision-making not so much takes over or supersedes the national, as it overflows or messes up or introduces a stutter into the nationally based lenses of power and influence. There is indeed no Europe without the nation state. There are also no successful nation states in Europe without the EU today. Effective state power requires the EU. And this is why states very wisely invest in the Union. The more effective the nation state, the more systematically it invests in the Union. The problem is that our analysis of identity and influence tell us what power is and where it is in terms of a specifically territorial and state-like story of politics and belonging. They don't tell us about the nowhere, a transnational regulatory power. To be clear, there is nothing wrong with the nation state or a national perspective as such. The simplification that I am trying to highlight is the received wisdom that the EU and the nation state are distinct and there is a certain balance of power between them. That simplification contains our thought and imagination of where power is, can be, or ought to be. I have thus highlighted two analytical habits that generate some closed thought patterns about Europe's probable and possible futures. So how would a more open-ended thinking look like, you might ask? I suggest simply that we shift our lens first. The work toward that open-ended thinking does not begin with devising a new policy. It begins with shifting our perspective away from these habitual patterns. The suggestion that binds both points together concerns the way we locate power and influence. We tend to imagine power in terms of territorial blocks, as if power was a tile game of building territory. This leads us to see territorial and state-like geography of power first, and imagine the future in terms of that geography first. To imagine the future differently is to start from some other place. We need to locate power differently. I end with a point from a diplomat in Brussels. He speaks of his profession, diplomacy, and what makes a good diplomat. Whatever else a diplomat might do, he observes, that person must be open to see new patterns. This call for an open mind and the feelings of uncertainty, discomfort, and dislocation that come with it is good advice to those interested in imagining different futures in Europe and for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Nuttall. I'm the Berlin Bureau Chief for the Economist. And I'm going to be moderating the discussion up here between our two keynote speakers and our three respondents. Of the three respondents, who wants to kick off? I'll take the shrugger over there. So, please, Wiener, you can start us off. Yeah.
Does it work? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for these two keynotes. One speaking of challenges and crisis and how to manage that, and the other about multiplicity and ambiguity. And let me start with something, a strange observation that came to me in the morning after all the insecurity talk yesterday. I don't want to do self-promotion, but this book, sort of its third revision, offered the authors to revise their theories and to pick case studies as their choices. And they were offered the economy, economic crisis, the refugee crisis, and the security crisis. And out of 12 chapters, none wrote about security. And so it seems to me, I mean, I problematize that in the end, and it seems to me that maybe it is about to we are about to turn, or to turn to more insecurity. And I wanted to make a point about this insecurity and also a notion of cracks that came up again and again in the various talks. You mentioned it. And of course, that leads me to the famous Leonard Cohen quote that I have to bring up here. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And that means we need to put our ear to the ground to listen to the irritations. And I will start with I wanted to make a point about a lost opportunity for collective foreign and security policy making in the European Union that started in the 1990s for not listening to the irritations on the ground. And that was just before massive enlargement with the infamous Copenhagen conditions, when the European Union started operating with two different logics. The West was looking forward in a collective, constructively to build the constitution, and the East was condemned to comply. Compliance with the famous values of the West. And this created resentment. So in a sense it opened fertile ground for a lot of the populism that we see now coming out of the Central and Eastern European countries. And so my point here is, from the perspective of somebody who practices recursive theorizing by looking at the cracks first and then see what do they do to our theories, that we should have been able to capture these two logics right from the beginning and then make multiplicity the key issue and bring the ambiguities to the fore. There is a way of doing that. There is a way of ensuring objections to particular policy goals that are, even, if qualitative majority voting were enhanced, then some minority voices were overlooked. And so the point here is more to find pathways of bringing in those who utter irritations. And it seems to me that insecurity is the better term then in order to start how to do this. And I don't know how brief you want me to be, but I could close here with saying a challenge then must not necessarily mean crisis, but a challenge for, and I would put that to politicians and policymakers, a challenge is really to adopt new policy practices that would facilitate a way of listening to these irritations first, and secondly then to proactively engage the contestants of various, in various policy situations. And I think I close there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's lots to chew over already. We've got two more speakers, so shall I turn to you? Mr. Ole Jacobsending from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm from Norway. Norway is not part of the EU. I'm not an EU scholar. So I'm looking at this slightly from the outside. I think what Merje said about the understanding of the EU's power is quite important here, and there are two aspects to it. I think one, that given increased geopolitical competition, the EU will be forced over time to get its act together on foreign policy, to be more coordinated and so on, simply because the competition will force the EU to do certain things that it's not able to do now. But all of that depends on one very important thing, which is strong domestic or sufficient domestic political support, which isn't there at the moment. And there is one very simple solution to that. It's about taxation. Support in most, I think, European countries, the last data I looked at, is quite strong for redistribution. And for the state to serve as a cushion and to basically balance different types of risks relating to transition is going to be even more complicated with the green transition. But all of this depends on the state actually being able to do that. And many, many European states and also elsewhere have had policies for a very long time where they have deprived themselves precisely of that opportunity to provide that type of cushion to its citizens. And you can see, I think, some of the populism polarization that you can see can be attributed in part to the state not being able to serve that function that the state claims that it can serve. So getting that in order will, I think, establish the EU on a much, much stronger footing to be a more forceful player on the world stage.
Thank you. Just a point of clarification on that. Is your suggestion that some states have, as it were, ceded their own power and their own authority in the grip of a sort of an outdated ideology? They have weakened themselves from within and therefore weakened the potential of the EU as a security player because its individual members have been, as it were, weakened from within. Is that the suggestion?
Yes. So there is this dominant, has been for some time, right, that the state has lost its ability to basically govern because pressures from globalization, a lot of this is blamed on Brussels, obviously, but there are two issues here. One is the issue of taxation. So your summary was correct, but there is another issue as well, which is that the scope for governments, national governments, to actually govern within the parameters, either at the EU level or, you know, WTO rules or whatever, is much greater than people tend to think. So it's a matter of figuring out what is the policy space available to address the issues that come up.
Thank you. I'm sure we can get into the relationship between domestic developments and the foreign policy space in the discussion. But before we do that, then over to Janne Jokinen, who's the Deputy Director of the Policy Planning Unit at the Finnish Foreign Ministry.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation. My first remark to you is that I'm a policy planner. I'm one of those guys with the tinfoil hats at the ministry. So if you want specific speaking points on EU competition policy, I'm not your guy. I'm here to really, as the organizers suggested, try to find new ideas, new perspectives, new ways of looking at things. I would go back to history. The remark was made that we look too much at history these days. We look backwards. Yes, of course, history is great in the sense that you can always find something that appeals to you, the arguments for your case. And at this particular moment, I would look back to 1989, 1990, 1991. What was Europe then? The Berlin Wall coming down, the Warsaw Pact falling apart, the Soviet Union collapsing. If you haven't in a while, I would recommend going back to the Color Trilogy by Krzysztof Kieslowski. Watch The Blue. I mean, it's incredible how self-evident the European identity and this great progressive future is in that movie. You know, it's about a person and her personal development, but what's given in the background is Europe. It's a concept, we know what it is, and it's moving forward, and we are all in it together. The Poles, the Finns, the Germans, everybody. You have Ode to Joy, it's in the background all the time. Well, the music's great too. So after the conference, let's go and rewatch that and capture that spirit. And when I was thinking about the topic, I was wondering when did we lose it? What happened? Probably one reason for that is that so many of us see the European Union as a technocratic project. It's old functionalism. You tinker a little bit, you add wheels, and it becomes something better. But you know, it's not very emotionally appealing or agitating. And I guess human beings need some kind of an emotional attachment, symbols, identity. And what we have forgotten during the past 30 years was this idea of a Europe, one whole and free. Not just within Europe, but perhaps outside Europe as well. So, go watch the movie and let's get back to this. Because I think we need to rebuild Europe from the bottom up. And this question of inequality actually enters that picture, because that's at the source of so much of the unhappiness. I have a sense, and social media, of course, makes this even stronger, that others are moving forward, others have the better vacations, the nicer families, the greater salaries, what have you. It's an illusion to a great extent, but it affects the reality that I have. So you have to go inside the societies, inside the nation states, address the inequality, rebuild the democratic legitimacy of government in general. And then that is reflected at the European level. Whenever I talk to Europeans or others who appreciate Europe, the European Union, the idea of Europe actually in a more general fashion, so that you are included as well. At present, please join us. Whenever I talk to people about this, it's the legitimacy question that does come up, and that's where we are attacked. So we are an elite. I think all of us in this room would be included in that. The Euro elite that has this technocratic project promoting its own interests and leaving people behind. So this is where we have to focus, and it's not easy. It's really, really difficult, especially since we have the echo chambers and we have opposing forces. There are those who are quite happy with a weak, divided Europe that doesn't see a future for itself, that grasps at whatever messiah is offered to us from the outside. And values, I think we really need a 1989 moment where we take a serious look at what we actually want. And this goes back to the values question. It's easy and sometimes you have to make compromises, but there are certain things where I would not like to see the compromises made. And once you re-engage people and have a real discussion about this, I think most people would agree that it's not right and proper to throw somebody in jail without just cause, without some sort of a proper trial. You probably shouldn't use violence against people, kill them. These things probably, according to most or all of us, are bad. And this is actually what it's about in the end. And whether you have a say in your own governance or not. And before I start talking about literature, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all five of you. I think we only actually have about half an hour left, and I certainly want to bring the audience in. So I will ask everybody to keep their interventions fairly snappy now. There are a lot of disparate threads to pull together, but I think I want to start with something quite crunchy. Kuus, in your talk, you said that commentators are condemned to eternal disappointment because they're always sort of applying a nation-state model to what they might, to the realities, the messy realities and place-based realities of European foreign policy. One of those people who I think has made his disappointment very clear is not a commentator, but he is a president of a very large country called France. And I think Niels, he was sort of hovering over a lot of Emmanuel Macron was hovering over a lot of what you said in your talk. You didn't name him, but he has made some rather potent comments recently in an interview with my newspaper about the future of NATO, about enlargement, about the transatlantic relationship. And I wanted to ask you, because some members of the government in which you serve have made their displeasure with some of these ideas rather clear, if you could explore that a little bit. And in particular, I think at the core of a lot of what Macron was saying was about the need for Europe to hedge against the withdrawal of the United States as a security partner. And so when Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer said that Macron was saying we need to replace NATO, I don't think that's quite what he was saying, but I think he was saying we need to have a plan in our back pocket in case this all goes wrong. So can you offer some thoughts on where you see the German approach and more broadly the European approach, what that should be if what looks like a weakening of the transatlantic relationship outlasts this particular American president?
Okay. Look, I was sure that you would be mentioning Macron, so there was no need for me to do that. But sure, I mean, if you look at Europe and the history of European integration, and I mentioned that in my introductory as well, you cannot replace the consensus-building approach of all the members by an E3 or E2 strategy. It's not going to work. And we know that, people always looking with some suspicion if Germany and France are moving too fast in a certain direction. Interestingly enough, the same countries sometimes are criticizing us if we don't take a leadership role. So if even Germany and France cannot agree, how could we proceed? So that has been part of decision making. And I think this is my personal observation. I think there are different motives for what the French president did over the last weeks and months. First of all, we have to recognize that there is a certain disappointment because some of the broad visions and ideas, although we were not always clear about how concrete those visions and ideas have been, but I think we need to be honest in assessing that there's a disappointment that Germany was not picking up all of the French president's initiatives. And that's, I mean, it's fair to have a discussion about that. And there is a discussion within our own country whether or not Germany has been leading enough in terms of bringing the European political project and the European economy ahead. That is one aspect that seems to motivate some of the decisions. The other discourse, which I believe has a lot of support and is also part of our debate, is we cannot ignore what President Trump has been doing. So the discourse about European sovereignty is an important one. But I think also the proposals that my boss Heiko Maas just made yesterday in Brussels made it clear that we need to do both. It's not good policy to think about replacing the role of the United States when everybody knows that this is not realistic, at least not in a short or medium-term perspective. So to use your expression of hedging also means to invest in a relationship that is very difficult to manage right now, but which we don't see an alternative. And that's why I was not very happy about everything the president said about NATO, not because the analysis has been rejected by us. It's also, I mean, Heiko made it very clear that we share a core of the analysis. Maybe not the wording, it's not a very German wording, but does anybody believe we would have a NATO-like treaty being voted on in the US Congress today? That's unrealistic. So I think we need to improve our own policies, but also defend the current structures. That is not only true for NATO. That's why we have that alliance for multilateralism and trying to strengthen the existing structures, although some of them are not very complete or not perfect. And you asked me to be brief, so my last sentence is that yes, we are very disappointed about the decision on Northern Macedonia. And if we don't take care of that, that could have a long-lasting impact on our credibility, but also on the ability of the European Union to project power in a region that is at our heart. And so there are cameras in the room, I should be cautious, but I don't think that decision is being motivated by any strategy or vision or idea on Europe. I think that's domestic politics, and that's very regrettable, but it's part of the European reality. And as you mentioned, winning majorities and legitimacy for what we are doing is a job that we know from our daily doings as well. Yeah, it's not an easy situation right now, but at least we are discussing. So, and we all wanted to be looking with an optimistic perspective on the agenda. So that's how I understood that Hamburg session. So let's put it in a positive way there. Yeah, we have some discussions, there's some provocations, but we have now with Heiko's proposals something on the table that, to my impression, everybody, almost everybody at least, made a positive reference yesterday at the meeting in Brussels. So things are moving forward.
Just very briefly, because you mentioned it, the French have now proposed some reforms to the accession process. This is their answer to critics who say there is no, well, you just said that there is no strategy here. Does the German government take these proposals seriously?
We always take every proposal seriously. We never rejected a proposal out of hand. And we never did that with France anyway. So there is a discussion right now. But I'm not going to repeat what I said before. We have to look into it.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Wiener, you said that in the 90s, you had a nice phrase. I think you said the East, as it was preparing to accede to the European Union, it was condemned to comply. And I think it's ideas like that that have started to gain wider circulation now as we think about the meaning of 1989. Certainly inside Germany, where the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall has just been celebrated. I think I've done a lot of reporting on this, and a lot of people I met in the former East told me that these sorts of issues are being thought about in a much more sophisticated way than they ever had been in the past. Previous commemorations, anniversaries had essentially been celebrations created and that took place largely in the West. Now we're starting to think a lot more in a slightly more complicated way about some of the difficulties of, in the German case, reunification, in the European case, the enlargement of the EU. So I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit more and give us a sense of if we are now starting to understand that the experience in the European case of enlargement was a little bit more complicated than we have sometimes previously seen, what should that imply for the relationship between the West and the East? And what should that imply for the way in which the halves of the continent come together when they're trying to forge a common foreign and security policy?
Well, thank you for picking up on that. The part that I didn't mention in my comment earlier is that this condemnation to comply was, I mean, there was a turnaround because countries and representatives protested and actually demanded clearer strategies or policies with regard to the shared values that, like sovereignty, like democracy, like fundamental rights. And at the time, in 2004, I called that contested compliance. And so there was agency there. There was a clear indication of agency, preparedness, knowledge. That was all there, but it wasn't picked up. And certainly as researchers in the university, a lot of the majority of at the time was celebrated for finding ways of enforcing compliance, of coercion vis-a-vis the West. And so, and those of us who cautioned and said, look, you need to look at contestations, you need to look at the cracks and enable the light to shine in rather than to paper over them, were kind of silenced. And it's all coming back to us now, and it seems to me that whilst, and we had a lot of reference on the shared values and the ideas of Europe, those are still shared, but in a very diffuse and elusive ways. But we need more discussions, and I'm very happy that Niels and Annen agrees that discussion is a good thing, contestation is a good thing, and we need more discussion about how to exactly implement these values? What do they mean in different situations in different countries? And even 10 years ago, I could demonstrate quite clearly that not even the United Kingdom and Germany were anywhere close with regard to the main values of Europe, like democracy, human rights, and sovereignty. And if that doesn't count for 2 of the oldest member states, then what do we expect from the rest?
I wanted to pick up on a theme that came up in the second half of your talk, Professor Kuus, but other people might want to jump in as well. If I understood you correctly, and do correct me if I'm wrong, you said that some of these sort of the analytical tools that we have to interpret and understand European power, they sort of mask the genuine power of the European Union, which is transnational and is regulatory. And you mentioned passporting rights, which is something that we in Britain have rather belatedly started to discuss with some vigor because all of our financial firms are worried about losing it. More broadly, and I think in keeping with perhaps the theme of this conference, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but also thoughts from some of the other panelists on to what extent the regulatory power that the European Union very clearly has, and that it has strong influence over the rest of the world, as we see with something like the GDPR, for example, data protection regulation, to what extent that can serve as a substitute or a complement to more traditional notions of power, of hard power, of security, the sorts of things that the European Union has traditionally not been very good at.
Thank you. Power is very complex, and there are all kinds of it. And so the regulatory power and, let's say, traditional, say, military power are all forms of power. So I highlight the regulatory one simply because we tend to understand the regulatory one as if it was watered down military power, and that's what leads us. And I think that the effort to understand regulatory power and then seeing as if it's not real or not yet real because it doesn't look like military power, I think it comes from that idea that power is sort of, you build power as if you build territory. But clearly both matter. But it's interesting that, so they both matter and both are real in existence in the world, but the trouble is, what I try to highlight is that, again, it's the lens that we look at regulatory power and we try to see state power behind it. And what if regulatory power, of course states are integrally involved in it, but what if the states don't fully control in it? What if it is actually a different animal and you cannot play a tile game with it? And that's where the stutter comes in. We don't quite have vocabulary, and frankly, neither do I. So I'm not proposing a different vocabulary, I'm just saying we need to be really careful before we go into very confident pronouncements about how EU should be stronger, why it can't be stronger. We need to be very careful about what assumptions we bring into those pronouncements. So really the comment was very much about the analytical lens.
Okay. Does anybody want to? Yeah, please.
That's also an aspect of narratives. I think one of the thoughts behind this conference is precisely that what we hear nowadays, much more than 5 years ago, is the description of power in a very old-fashioned way. So it's all about fighter planes and aircraft carriers and laser shooting robots in space. And to some extent, this is not by accident, because there are those in the world whose power is based on these very traditional means. And their idea is to pull everyone else to that level, because that's when their power matters more. As you said, if we enter that discussion and accept this terminology, these measures of what influence is, then we have already lost the game to some extent. On the other hand, you have to maintain a very careful balance here, because while we hold on to the special capabilities of the EU and I would say multilateral organizations in general, this whole other world of power and influence and how to measure it, we have to live in the same world with those who see the world in a different way, and we have to have effective responses to them. And this is something that we struggle every day when we think about European sovereignty and common foreign security policy and how to take European defense forward in this world. How do we discuss with those people who come with the narrative of military power solely to the table?
Can I just jump in on this? Because I think your observation was very good. The good news for the EU, I think, is that the type of, what do you call it, regulatory power, or basically market power that the EU has, is becoming, relatively speaking, more important. That is the terrain on which geopolitical competition will more and more be out. So in that regard, EU is much better positioned than if the case was that the arenas where this type of competition took place was more of the traditional, conventional military one. That's still there, of course, will always be there, but it is, in relative terms, shifting towards market type of competition. And the reason for this is, of course, that there is competition, but there's also increased globalization. So Apple's production is in China. So there are those relations, but that is precisely why I think the EU has much more significant power than one often tends to think.
Can I just say one response to Janne, your point, and to build on that? You said, rightly so, that we live still meanwhile in a world where we do need to have responses to those who peddle the traditional military power. The interesting thing is that, and you're absolutely correct, but it's interesting that in often cases, those who peddle the more traditional understandings of power are not asked to provide a reasoned, good response to those who support, let's say, more transnational understandings of power. And so we need to both have a response, but also demand that they themselves also respond. And we often let them off the hook because we already assume that they know what they're talking about and we don't challenge them.
We'll turn to the audience in a moment, but I'm just imagining myself, if I was on this panel as a sort of an American general or a French military planner, and I was hearing this discussion about fresh conceptions of power as a sort of a market power, a regulatory power, then I might say, guys, you have to your east. I might bring up some of the things that Niels brought up in his introduction. I might look at Russia and Ukraine. I might look at the turmoil in the parts of the Middle East. I might look at the threat of a renewed migration crisis in Europe and say, well, it's all very well that you guys are able to think very cleverly about how to regulate data protection or the strength of the single market, but you also need to understand that traditional conceptions of power remain extremely relevant inside of Europe, and that some countries, if I was America, I might even single out Germany, are not necessarily pulling their weight when it comes to meeting the 2% target in NATO or focusing on military capabilities. So maybe a response, Neil, to this suggestion from this notional American commander sitting on this panel.
Look, I do regret that this is becoming more and more the discourse of the German think tank community as well. You know, I saw a tweet of my friend Ambassador Ischinger yesterday, and for me it was so typical for the German discussion that we are in. It's like a loop that we are not able to get out. I don't know what is happening there. So he tweeted something very nicely about Heiko Maas's initiative to the NATO meeting, but then said, yeah, but it lacks credibility because, I don't quote him literally, you have to look it up, but the meaning was that it's not going to be very credible because Germany is not putting its economic weight behind NATO's defense capabilities, and we're missing the 2% goal. So, you don't only have that view on what we are doing from the United States or maybe from other actors. And as I said, I mean, we can have that discussion, but we're having that discussion every year at Munich, and it's not really bringing us forward. Because if you look at what we are doing, we are spending billions every year in additional appropriations for our military. I never voted against that, because I believe it's what we need to do. Our armed forces need to be in a better shape. But even if I would somehow have the magical formula to get all the money they want, even then it's not going to move us forward. They have deep structural problems. I mean, our armed forces are performing outstandingly in very dangerous parts of the world, in Mali, for example, in Afghanistan. But there are deep structural problems, and we need to address these problems. And I also think the responsible minister should address these problems. So what is adding to security, and what is adding also to our power projection? That's what we need to have a discussion about, and not about an abstract number. And I think it's one aspect in the foreign and security toolbox. Is it becoming more important? Yes, it is. And we will not be able to solve a dilemma which has always been part in Europe, but which becomes much more visible because of the current crisis. That is that countries like Germany, but I mean we are also becoming a more average country if you look at our right-wing nationalist type sitting in the Bundestag today, but we still have a strong consensus that working together is the way that gives us more ability to act. Integration, everybody wins. That is what we experienced. But it's not what everybody believes in the European Union anymore. And it's certainly not what Russia or the United States and other powers believe. So I think we need to balance. We can afford to lose the integration surpluses. But we need also to have a reaction to those zero-sum thinkers. That's just the reality. But to what I am looking at with some concern is that the so-called German strategic debate is becoming a very narrow debate on defense spending, and that doesn't give you any indication whatsoever on our abilities, and our abilities are much more. The German abilities, but also the European abilities.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll turn to the audience now, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'll ask you please keep it brief, identify yourself, and I might take a group of maybe 2 or 3 questions, and if you could tell us who you're approaching with your questions, well, that would be useful. So, in the back here. I assume do we have a microphone? Oh, we can donate one from the stage. There you go. Don't drop it. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Sabine Mokri. I'm a PhD student at Leiden University, and I'm currently a visiting research fellow here at the GIGA in Hamburg. My question goes to Professor Wiener and Professor Kuus. So if a young policymaker would come up to you, what would you advise him or her on how to unlearn established policy practices? How could policymaker do that? And I'm looking for very concrete suggestions. Maybe also not only the young policymakers, but the more established policymakers who are sitting here.
Thank you. Do we have, just in the next row.
Thank you very much. My name is Johanna Sumovori. I'm State Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Finland. Thank you for your insights. I came a bit in the middle of the panel, but there were a lot of insights I would like to comment on and ask a question. First of all, someone mentioned that not listening to the irritations or ambiguities is one of the reasons why we are in this kind of a disruptive mode now. There was talk about lost European identity or spirit, and state as a provider of a cushion against different adversities of life. I was thinking of these all things lead to the question of inclusivity, which is one of the core things in Finnish government program. How do you see the question of inclusivity in terms of democracy, maybe economic wealth, distribution of power and so forth? Because I think it tangles both with individuals and states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then here.
Thank you. Mark Galliotti from London, UCL and RUSI. A couple of months back, I was in Moscow talking to some young cosmopolitan liberal Russians before Macron's statement that they were all Europeans. And they were absolutely saying the same thing, saying, of course we are Europeans, culturally, historically, in every sense we're Europeans. It's a shame that European Union has lost its way slightly. So the interesting thing was they actually had a values-based critique of the European Union. So my question for whoever might want to tackle it is, where do Europe's boundaries lie? And how far is this about values? How far is this about policy? Obviously, we'd like to think that the two are always in step, but they aren't.
Thank you. Who wants to pick up any of those questions? We had a first question addressed to a very practical question of how do you unlearn bad policy practices?
Okay, now I am offered to be first. Thank you. I would say, first of all, I would say, I'm so glad that you recognize, to that hypothetical person, I'm so glad you recognize that all learning begins with unlearning, the assumptions first. And one learns, including unlearns, the way you learn in anything. Don't assume that you know. Be very careful about your assumptions. Don't assume that you know what the other person thinks, even if they peddle party line. So often people peddle the party line and trade in cliches because they have given up. They assume that's what the other person wants to hear. And of course, especially person junior in a power hierarchy would peddle the received wisdom to a more senior person. And I would say, don't assume that the senior person necessarily wants to hear that cliche. Invitation to thought might take you a little bit further than you first think it would. So be an optimist.
Yeah, well, unlearn. Well, you can only unlearn if you've got a voice, and that must be a critical voice. And I think, Sabrina, you asked especially for young policy makers. So that then you need a healthy skepticism vis-a-vis hierarchies. And look at the invisible rules that sort of work as a shadow of the past, so that you simply pick up on things how they've been done before. And the one argument in a meeting that you should always be sort of very critical about is when somebody says that's the way we've done it before and it always worked. If that always worked, then the problem weren't there on the table. So in a sense, that's I would encourage people to be more sort of bold and raise critical questions. And so for that, you of course need to be practicing interactions and discussions, and rather than following rules.
Thank you. And then we had two other questions. We had one on inclusivity. We had one on Europe's values and Europe's borders. Yeah, please.
Yeah, on the inclusivity, I'm repeating myself here, but my point is that, so normally when we talk about foreign policy, there is the assumption that we just leave the domestic stuff aside. It's pretty obvious to me that that doesn't work any longer. I think we wouldn't be having this type of discussion if there wasn't a lot of polarization and Brexit, etc., in Europe. Now, in order to address that, you have to think differently about redistribution and inclusion at the state level. And so, as it is now, the EU and also multilateral organizations like the IMF are seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So what needs to happen is basically reversing that. So the EU helps, the state looks good, and in many cases now it doesn't. And I think a big part of that challenge has to do with what the state can do to provide that cushion and do redistribution in light of transformations and risks.
Okay, I'll take the values question. What are the borders of Europe? Yeah, it's a very good question. From a value perspective, I don't see any borders whatsoever, because I believe these values are universal. So I always get a little bit hesitant when people start talking about the liberal international order, because it leads to the debate on Western values and Eastern values, and my values are not your values, and that leads to nowhere. So from this perspective, Europe doesn't have any borders, then it's a different question when we start discussing the borders of the European Union and who should be in and who should be out. But normatively, no borders whatsoever. Just a slight note, and I find myself in a very strange position, but I have to defend the American general. Because perhaps the best of them, who have thought things the most deeply, they always talk about the State Department. Please give more money, more people to diplomacy and to development cooperation, so that we don't have to fight the wars. You know, those people who actually know what war is, this is their point of view. So, in defense of the American general.
Wasn't necessarily where I was expecting to end up, but I think maybe we do have time just for a last round of questions and then we'll close. So we've got two in the front here. Thank you. And then right in the back, and then one here, and then I think we'll have to close. Please keep it very brief.
Yeah, so Nick Rajkovic, I'm chair at Tilburg University. So Professor Kuus, I want to clarify something. So you say we need to unlearn. And I could interpret that as a very sterile liberal way, or we could take it more radically, and I'm just not sure which way you're driving it. So would you agree that unlearning is actually about decolonizing, in the sense of decolonizing certain established ways of thinking about geopolitics and about thinking about geography? Because if it is about that term, decolonization, that's a big job. It's a big job, just as many countries in the global south understand that development is far more complicated post-formal decolonization.
Okay, thank you. And there was another one in the same row.
It struck me as the conversation was developing, and I think maybe everyone would have a different response to this on the panel, so it's to all of you, I suppose, that we started with this incredibly rich description of the challenges we face that run from climate change to, you know, the automation of labor, to the erosion of values, to all these different kinds of crises, which are quite multidimensional. But by the end of the conversation, when we're actually talking about political action, the conversation very quickly narrowed around a very technocratic description of the projection of power and geopolitics and a very traditional understanding of security. And so I wonder, like, if we're really taking this question of insecurity seriously, what are our other models for global political action and intervention, which are not about whether or not Germany or NATO or some combination thereof can project or guarantee or something beyond that notion of the liberal order. Yeah.
Thank you. And then right at the back. Actually, maybe if we can take this one in the middle and then we'll go to the back. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Rebecca Pedi from Greece and the University of Macedonia. Speaking of values, and Russia cannot avoid thinking about Turkey, who interestingly enough, he has been absent from the discussion. So I wanted to ask Mr. Annen and Mr. Jokinen, how can we think in creative ways and in constructive ways about Turkey these days, Turkey and the EU? Thank you.
Thank you. And then final question at the back.
Thank you so much. Cornelia Diana Bacciudea, the postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. I have two questions. One is related to Brexit. How do you assess the impact of Brexit? We don't know the outcome yet, but so far during these 3 years of negotiations, the EU and the EU member states have been able to project unity towards particularly towards the Irish issues and to the EU stance on Brexit. What impact you think the withdrawal of the UK will have on the future of Europe in terms of European integration, but also on European strategic culture and power relations, particularly here I'm thinking of the French-German cooperation. And the second question is related to the substantive impact of the 2% debate, which was mentioned in the discussion. I think it's quite interesting because, if I'm not mistaken, France has a similar defense spending in absolute terms as Germany has. And interestingly, it has another projection of it, so it has been able to show a quite solid discourse, where the things in Germany, although it has similar defense spending in absolute terms, things look quite differently. So I was thinking, why do you think France is able to do a much bigger bang with the same money, and where are the weaknesses in the German discourse? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think I'll just go to each panelist and you can just pick up whatever you want because we're running out of time. 5 questions. How radical should unlearning be? A response to this suggestion that we need to move beyond traditional understandings of security, which is a rather large question for the end of the discussion. A question on Turkey, a question on the impact of Brexit on the European strategic culture, and then this notion of why do France and Germany have such different conversations and capabilities when they're spending the same amount on security. So pick up whatever you want. Please be brief. Who wants to start? You can start.
First of all, happy to hear a question from, I assume, from SAIS. Great school, I've been there myself. So I try to answer that question. Turkey is not a normal country for Germany for very obvious reasons. So I think there's a European look on Turkey, but there's also a very, very peculiar situation that we are having. I just had a discussion about Turkey's role in Syria in my district a couple of days ago. Everything that is happening there in terms of tension, you can see reflected very easily on German streets, including sometimes violent conflict. So whatever Turkey is going to do, whether it will remain in NATO or is going to look at other powers, whatever decision there is going to be taken, it has an impact on Germany. So that's why we are not shy on criticizing what is happening there. All the contrary. But I think we have an understanding that Turkey today is such a difficult partner with decisions like, the invasion in northern Syria or the decision for the Russian anti-aircraft system, etc. But would that become easier for us to deal with Turkey if they leave NATO or if we end the accession process? I think there are very few arguments for that. I couldn't rule out the possibility that this is going to happen. But Turkey is also still a very vital democracy under threat. But we have new majorities in the major cities. Istanbul's mayor, Imanoglu, just visited Germany. So if we think long term, I think it's very important to understand and to comprehend the full dimension of what is going on in that country right now and who is our partner in this. So I'm very cautious in terms of radical actions, but what I feel here as well is that many Germans have the impression that we should be tougher on Turkey. Germans believe that Turkish politics is messy and emotional and we are very rational. When it comes to Turkey, that is not always the case. But it's not our job in the decision making to copy that same attitude. So I'm very concerned about it. It has a strategic impact. Everybody can see this. And I just came back from the counter-Daesh coalition meeting in Washington. And I can tell you that there was not a single country at the table that shared Turkey's view on the situation. Not a single country. And until the very end, conference was already over. We couldn't agree on a communique. At the end of the day, Turkey agreed to the text. That was not very, very positive for Turkey's interest. But it showed me that even though they gave a very emotional speech and they was a very confrontational attitude, they had also no interest in staying alone. And we need to politically use that ability that I hope we still have to influence Turkey's policies. But I cannot give you any guarantee on that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. I'll pick up the security question and the geopolitics. I didn't really read the discussion the way you did, but you're probably pushing the point a little bit to invite us to more contestations. Well, if you look at various sectors in which security policy happens, or various policies, and I mean, I can get carried away talking about models, but with my own cycle grid model, what I found, if you look at the women, peace and security area, then you have a large distribution of affected stakeholders over a variety of scales. And from that area, we learn how, through multiple-sided analysis across various scales and stages in the policy process, we can involve more affected stakeholders and therefore come to novel solutions in a case. So that would be one thing, the point for multiple-sided and multiple-scale policymaking. And then if you play that back, sort of zooming into the local sites, coming back to the Security Council, you end up devising powerful tools from the practices on the ground in order to question the way the United Nations Security Council actually works. I mean, the entire Chapter 7 discussion in this field, for example. So there you have it. That's relatively sort of spreading it, I think, in a productive way.
Thank you. Just two points. One, there's a question addressed specifically to me about unlearning, and then a point about Brexit. You asked how radical should the unlearning be. I would argue all unlearning is both gradual and radical at the same time. So I would not try to reach for another ready-made toolbox, such as decolonization or various Ds or various terminologies, but stay at the level of everyday language and say all learning is partly about unlearning. And so I would actually not even answer, and that's quite deliberate, the question of is decolonization part of it? Because I think too often, especially academics, you contest one toolbox and you go for another ready-made toolbox, and I really want to avoid that and continue staying in a position of sort of incredulity toward all ready-made toolboxes. And just a very small point about Brexit, and I don't know, of course, how it's going to play out, so I'm not going to answer that question. But Tom, you said something earlier that in Britain there is now somewhat belatedly a discussion of passporting rights. And I think you're right. That somewhat belatedly is such an interesting thing. Britain has no lack of bright minds, no lack of first-rate universities. The City of London. What assumptions must be in place, or what is the origin of the blind spot that the country such as Britain was so slow recognizing the importance of passporting rights? And it's just eternally fascinating to me. Why did they miss that? And so some of my intervention comes from asking that question, okay, why did they miss that?
I'll just let that question float over me. Final thought.
Just a very brief comment on the different dimensions of security. You're quite right. I mean, we focused on maybe more traditional issues. Those are important, but the big thing that we didn't discuss that much is the long-term challenges, risks relating to climate change, of course, where I think you will see that what we now tend to define in terms of societal security, which is much lower down in the hierarchy of importance, will become much, much more important and get up, and of course linked to financial risks relating to climate change. So I hope we'll get the chance to discuss that later today and tomorrow.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's climate change is the biggest cloud on the horizon, and it is very revealing in the sense that traditional means of projecting power don't really work, and you need new solutions. On Turkey, of course, no simple answers. So what I can say from my perspective as a policy planner, what I would perhaps recommend is nothing novel. It's patience. Being clear on your own positions, keeping a cool head, Let's not be provoked, because that usually there's a motivation behind the provocations, and that's not something, that's not a game that we should enter if we can avoid it. And then reach out to the Turkish society on as many levels as you can. One aspect of that is the Turkish diaspora in Europe. I have a feeling that quite often these diasporas, there's a lot more potential there than what we are using. And it's an excellent thing, because Europe, if you exclude Turkey from Europe, reaches the Turkish society not just through the politicians and the diplomats and the media, but at a very personal level. So between societies you have these incredible links. And in the long term, I believe that that has a very, very important effect. How can we tap into that potential? That's the question. And let's have a discussion about that, because you probably have more ideas than I do. Thank you.
To be continued. Okay, I will keep you from your coffee no longer. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to all of you, and we'll convene shortly.